Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for our AMD Radeon RX 7800 XT review. Yes, Steve is still a little bit sick, so I will be presenting his review for you all today. Normally we'd have a GPU here to show you on the table, so just pretend that we've got one and it's sitting here. Maybe we'll CGI that in later. I'm sure you'll see some B-roll. But anyway, 7800 XT review. So let's get into it. Today's video is sponsored by Bitdefender Total Security, an award-winning software solution to protect your devices with no compromise to performance. Bitdefender offers multi-layer threat protection to combat many forms of attack, including ransomware and zero-day exploits, keeping you safe against increasingly sophisticated threats. It also works to keep your privacy intact, featuring tools to detect and prevent unauthorized webcam and microphone access, as well as blocking web trackers that are looking to steal your data. If you're worried about performance like we all are here at Hardware Unboxed, Bitdefender detects activity like gaming sessions, halting pop-ups and unimportant background activities during those crucial periods of intense system usage. Bitdefender Total Security offers protection across 5 devices, including those running Windows, macOS, Android and iOS. So to learn more and protect your hardware today at a great price, click the link in the description below. At this point, it's hard to think of the 7800 XT as new, despite this being the first time we've been able to show you it, and that's because the first RDNA 3 based GPUs were released last year, back in December of 2022, when we got the 7900 XT and the XTX model. That's pretty crazy, and I don't think there has ever been a time in history where AMD or Nvidia took 9 months to release the bulk of their product stack. Normally after 9 months we'd be looking at refreshed or updated products, not a continuation of the initial release cycle. But here we are, AMD's finally releasing the successor to the impressive 3-year-old 6800 XT. So what have they got for us? Well, on paper they look quite similar, and it's hard to imagine the 7800 XT will be much, if any, step forward. The core count has been reduced by 17%, though the cores are clocking 8% higher, but based on that alone you'd expect the 7800 XT to be slower. Thankfully, some upgrades to the memory system have been made. The Infinity cache capacity has been halved, but the bandwidth has been increased by 63%. Then we see, while the same 256-bit wide memory bus is in use, the newer model receives faster 19.5 gigabits per second memory, which has increased the memory bandwidth by 22%. So with significantly more cache and memory bandwidth, the 7800 XT's fewer cores will be able to work much harder, but it's still difficult to imagine it being much faster than the 6800 XT in most games. Also, what I think is most interesting about the 7800 XT is the price, just $500 US, which is much lower than the $600 US that myself and Steve were expecting. It's also at odds with the rest of the RDNA 3 lineup. The 7900 XTX, for example, cost $10.41 per compute unit, and the XT version was a bit worse at $10.71. The 7800 XT though comes in at $8.33 per compute unit, a 20% discount when compared to the XTX. Basically, AMD had 2 options here: price the 7800 XT in line with the 7900 series, resulting in terrible reviews and sales, forcing them to drop prices, basically what we saw with the 7900 XT. If I were a betting man, this is what I would have put money on AMD doing, because their ability to read the market and learn as they go hasn't been all that impressive to date. The second option was to read the room, face reality, and price the 7800 XT accordingly, the least likely of the 2 options in my opinion. This option would see them drop the 7800 XT well below the expected $600 US asking price to something much more acceptable like $500, and lo and behold, that's what they did. Now, I did say in my most recent monthly GPU pricing update video that if the 7800 XT was to deliver 6800 XT-like performance, it would need to cost no more than $450 US. And while we're yet to look at the performance, the 7800 XT is at least priced much closer to our ideal price, certainly much more so than most other AMD and Nvidia current generation GPUs that we've seen to date. So that's good, but of course we have to check out the performance. For testing, we're using our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 memory using the latest display drivers. All data has been validated and updated for this video, and I'll be using the AMD reference version of the 7800 XT. In total, I've tested 16 games. Well, Steve's tested all of them, but yeah, he's tested 16 games, and we'll only look at the individual results for around a dozen of them with and without ray tracing before checking out the average performance and, of course, the cost per frame data. But please note all graphs will be made available to Patreon and Floatplane members. Okay, let's take a look at what we have. Starting with the Plague Tale Requiem, we see that the new 7800 XT is delivering 6800 XT-like performance at 1080p, making it slightly faster than the RTX 4070 and about on par with the RTX 3080. Then at 1440p, we're seeing identical performance to that of the 6800 XT with 88 FPS on average, making it 9% faster than the RTX 4070. So certainly nothing new here in terms of performance, though it's also quite reasonable given the $500 US MSRP. Interestingly, at the 4K resolution, the 7800 XT slips behind the old 6800 XT by a 12% margin with 51 FPS, so a very disappointing result there, despite beating the RTX 4070 by a rather large 11% margin. Next up we have Resident Evil 4, and starting with the 1080p data, we see that the 7800 XT is once again delivering 6800 XT-like performance, and that saw it roughly on par with the RTX 4070 and RTX 3080. Increasing the resolution to 1440p doesn't change much. The 7800 XT is basically just a 6800 XT here, making it a few frames faster than the RTX 4070. Then at 4K, we're again faced with 6800 XT-like performance from the 7800 XT, rendering 74 FPS on average to make it 12% faster than the RTX 4070. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, we have our first example where the 7800 XT is actually faster than the 6800 XT. Though we're only talking about an 8% uplift at 1080p. Still, that was enough to beat the RTX 4070 by a 9% margin. The 7800 XT fares even better at 1440p with 95 FPS on average, allowing it to match the 7900 GRE to come in 9% faster than the 6800 XT and 16% faster than the RTX 4070. Then at the 4K resolution, performance dropped to just 45 FPS on average, but still the 7800 XT was 22% faster than the RTX 4070. We're back to 6800 XT-like performance in Hogwarts Legacy, where the 7800 XT rendered 111 FPS, making it 16% faster than the RTX 4070. Frame rates dropped to 88 FPS at 1440p, but even so, that still meant the 7800 XT was 22% faster than the RTX 4070. Then at the 4K resolution, the margin over the RTX 4070 shrinks to 13%, and once again, in terms of performance, the 7800 XT looks to be a 6800 XT. Next up we have Forza Horizon 5, and you guessed it, 6800 XT-like performance from the new 7800 XT, making it a little faster than the RTX 4070. Jumping up to the 1440p resolution, the 7800 XT was good for 140 FPS, making it just 2 FPS faster than the 6800 XT. So basically the same performance there, and that meant it was 8% faster than the RTX 4070. Then at the 4K resolution, the 7800 XT was good for 101 FPS, which is a 12% increase over the RTX 4070, but just a 4% boost over the old 6800 XT. Now, Spider-Man Remastered is a very rare example where the 7800 XT is a good bit faster than the 6800 XT, delivering 11% more performance at 1080p, and yet despite that, it's slightly slower than the RTX 4070. The margin over the 6800 XT was reduced to just 8% at 1440p, while it was just 3% slower than the RTX 4070, though the 1% lows were much better. Then at the 4K resolution, the 7800 XT is just 6% faster than the 6800 XT and a mere 2% slower than the RTX 4070. The Last of Us Part 1 saw the 7800 XT rendering 111 FPS at 1080p to pull ahead of the 6800 XT by a mere 5% margin. Still, that meant it was 10% faster than the RTX 4070. Then at 1440p, we're looking at 81 FPS on average, which is a 7% increase over the 6800 XT and RTX 3080, and an impressive 11% boost over the RTX 4070. Jumping up to 4K, the 7800 XT is able to match the RTX 3080, while it was just a frame slower than the 7900 GRE and 2 frames slower than the 6950 XT. It was also 7% faster than the 6800 XT and a massive 26% faster than the RTX 4070. The last game we're going to look at for the individual results is Fortnite, and here the 7800 XT doesn't do all that well, coming in well behind the 7900 GRE and 6800 XT as it trailed by a 14% margin at 1080p. The same 14% performance deficit to the 6800 XT remained at 1440p, and that meant the 7800 XT was 16% slower than the RTX 4070. Then finally at 4K, the 7800 XT was 9% slower than the 6800 XT and 10% slower than the RTX 4070. So some disappointing numbers for the 7800 XT in Fortnite. Okay, so here's a look at our 15 game average, which largely focuses on rasterization performance, though not entirely, as Forza Horizon 5 and F122 were tested using the maximum quality preset, which does enable ray tracing, but we'll look at more RT focused data shortly. For now, we see that at 1080p, the 7800 XT is generally just a 6800 XT in terms of performance, which also meant it was comparable with the RTX 3080 and RTX 4070, beating the more expensive 4070 by a 3% margin. We're of course seeing much the same at 1440p. The 7800 XT was a whisker slower than the 7900 GRE, which meant it was just a few frames faster than the 6800 XT, so another 3% uplift in this example. Still, despite being $100 US cheaper than the RTX 4070, the 7800 XT was 6% faster on average, so at least relative to Nvidia's current generation offerings, the 7800 XT does look very good. Now at the 4K resolution, the 7800 XT and 6800 XT were neck and neck, but even so, the new $500 Radeon GPU was still 9% faster than the RTX 4070. So while pretty unexciting when compared to the 6800 XT, if you're coming from a much older GPU, the 7800 XT might actually be of interest. Here's a closer look at how the 7800 XT and 6800 XT compared across the 15 games tested at 1440p. As we saw, the 7800 XT was on average just 3% faster, but overall we have an interesting spread of results. The newer RDNA 3 GPU really struggled in Fortnite and Dying Light 2, while it offered nothing extra in half a dozen more titles. The only worthwhile wins were seen in Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 and Warhammer 3. Then versus the RTX 4070, we see that although the 7800 XT was 6% faster on average, the data is once again all over the place. The Radeon GPU crushed it in Modern Warfare 2, Hogwarts Legacy, Cyberpunk 2077, and The Last of Us Part 1, but also struggled in Fortnite, while coming up short in Hitman 3, Halo Infinite, Spider-Man, and Dying Light 2. Okay, so let's take another look at performance in A Plague Tale Requiem, but this time with ray tracing enabled. With RT enabled, the 7800 XT was limited to 67 FPS on average at 1080p in our test, which is a 6% improvement over the 6800 XT, but 26% slower than the RTX 4070. That margin was reduced to 20% at 1440p, which admittedly is still a big performance advantage for the GeForce GPU, even if it does cost 20% more. Then at 4K, we're reduced to just 30 FPS with the 7800 XT, which is a 25% performance reduction when compared to the RTX 4070, though it was once again comparable performance to the old 6800 XT. Moving on to Resident Evil 4 with the ray tracing quality preset, we see that the 7800 XT is good for 157 FPS at 1080p, which made it 10% faster than the 6800 XT and able to match the RTX 4070. It falls away slightly at 1440p, though here it only trailed the 4070 by a 3% margin, but was also just 3% faster than the 6800 XT. Then at 4K, we're still looking at very playable performance from the 7800 XT with 75 FPS to match the RTX 3080, as well as the 6800 XT and RTX 4070. AMD's ray tracing performance isn't up to the task in Cyberpunk 2077, as here the 7800 XT falls behind the RTX 4070 by a 22% margin at 1080p, with just 58 FPS on average, and here we are using the medium quality ray tracing preset. Still, the 7800 XT is priced to match the 16GB RTX 4060 Ti, and here it does match that particular product's performance. The 7800 XT averaged just 36 FPS at 1440p, making it 16% slower than the 4070, but also 6% faster than the 6800 XT and 9% faster than the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB. Then finally, at 4K, none of the tested GPUs are able to deliver playable performance at the native resolution. Ray tracing performance in Spider-Man Remastered is generally quite good, and we're certainly seeing that here with the 7800 XT at 1080p. With 148 FPS on average, it matched the 6800 XT to come in just 5% slower than the RTX 4070. Now at 1440p, the new Radeon GPU is 9% slower than the 4070, with 128 FPS on average, which also made it 7% faster than the 6800 XT. Then finally, at the 4K resolution, the 7800 XT was good for 76 FPS on average, and this saw it match the 6800 XT to come in just 8% slower than the RTX 4070. The second last game that we're going to look at ray tracing performance with is Fortnite, and here the 7800 XT actually manages to outperform the RTX 4070 at 1080p, delivering 7% more frames to hit 90 FPS. This was also a 7% uplift over the 6800 XT, so decent results there. The margin over the RTX 4070 shrank to 5% at 1440p, and now the 7800 XT is just able to average 60 FPS, but that's still a 9% boost over the 6800 XT. Then finally, we have the 4K resolution, and sticking to the native resolution, so no upscaling, we're only seeing 30 FPS from the 7800 XT and RTX 4070. Last up, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and here the 7800 XT rendered 87 FPS on average, which is the same level of performance seen from the 6800 XT, making the new Radeon GPU 8% slower than the RTX 4070, but 14% faster than the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB. Now at 1440p, the 7800 XT is just 6% slower than the RTX 4070 with 61 FPS on average, which is the same level of performance you'll receive from either the 6800 XT or RTX 3080. Then at the native 4K resolution, we're dropping down to just 32 FPS on average, so again the same performance you'll see from the RTX 3080 and 6800 XT, and around 6% slower than the RTX 4070. Okay, so across the half dozen titles that were tested with ray tracing enabled, we found that at 1080p, the 7800 XT was on average 10% slower than the RTX 4070 and on par with the RTX 3080, making it ever so slightly faster than the 6800 XT. It was also 15% faster than the similarly priced RTX 4060 Ti 16GB, so a bit of a win there for a new Radeon GPU. Then we see that the 7800 XT was good for an average of 69 FPS at 1440p, making it 9% slower than the RTX 4070 and 5% faster than the 6800 XT. Now, for those of you who are wanting to take advantage of ray tracing effects at 4K with these GPUs, it's not possible at the native resolution and will without question require the aid of upscaling. Still, relative to the RTX 4070, the 7800 XT does quite well here, as it's just 7% slower. Here's a look at how the 6800 XT and 7800 XT compared head-to-head across the half dozen RT titles. On average, the newer RDNA 3 GPU is offering a 5% performance improvement, so I guess that's not nothing, but the real win here is the price, and we'll look at that in a moment. Now, the 7800 XT is set to cost 17% less than the RTX 4070, so the fact it was only 8% slower on average across the ray tracing tests we looked at is a pretty good result. The big losses were seen in Cyberpunk 2077 and A Plague Tale Requiem, with the only win coming in the way of Fortnite, but overall, still not a bad result. Here's a quick look at total system power consumption in Hitman 3, and here we see that the 7800 XT reduced total system usage by 13% when compared to the 6800 XT for what amounted to roughly the same level of performance. The 7800 XT was just 4% slower than the RTX 4070 in this example, but here we see that it pushed total system usage 15% higher, which is quite a substantial increase. The Spider-Man results are a little more favourable, as here the 7800 XT reduced total system consumption by 9% when compared to the 6800 XT, while we only saw a slightly lower 12% increase over the RTX 4070. Still, there's no doubting the fact that the GeForce GPU is more power efficient. Alright, so this is the cost per frame data calculated using the MSRP and the results from our 15 game average. As expected, the 7800 XT looks quite good here, delivering by far the best cost per frame of any current or previous generation GPU, at least those that we've tested. When compared to the 6800 XT, we're looking at a 25% reduction in cost per frame for the 7800 XT and a 21% reduction when compared to the RTX 4070. So while I'm sure the 7800 XT's performance hasn't blown you away, at least the price isn't a disaster. Even when compared to current retail pricing, the 7800 XT fares very well, matching the value of the heavily discounted RX 6800. So not amazing, but also much better than what we were expecting prior to AMD announcing pricing. When compared to the heavily discounted $530 US 6800 XTs, the new 7800 XT is still 8% better value, and again a 21% improvement over the RTX 4070 is impressive. Now, if we were to recalculate everything using the ray tracing only data, This is what we'd find when looking at the MSRPs. The 7800 XT is still better value than the RTX 4070, reducing the cost per frame by 8%, and it would be a massive 26% better value than the 6800 XT. That's assuming the 6800 XT was still selling for $650 US. Of course, though, it's not, and at the discounted $530 US price, the 7800 XT is just 10% better value than the 6800 XT, so not nothing, but hardly a worthwhile generational uplift when put that way. I guess it's unfortunate that 3 years later there's still so much RDNA 2 stock, bit of a whoopsie there from the ordering department. Now, before we wrap this review up, here's a look at the operating behavior of the AMD reference model. After an hour of in-game load, it hit a junction temperature of 75 degrees Celsius with a peak hotspot of 85°C. So pretty good results there, though the fans were required to spin at 1600 RPM and were audible over the case fans. Not super loud, but the reference card did make itself known. As for the cores, they typically clocked at 2160 MHz when testing in The Last of Us Part 1 at 4K using the high quality settings, and as you can see, this sucked up a lot of VRAM. Now, PowerColor's Hellhound version is much larger than the reference model, and in terms of operating behavior is much more impressive. The GPU junction temperature peaked at just 68 degrees Celsius with a peak hotspot temperature of 77°C, so 8°C cooler than that of the AMD reference card, but that's not the whole story. The three fans spun at just 650 RPM to achieve those results, making the Hellhound virtually silent in our test system as it was much quieter than the system itself. Interestingly though, the cores only clocked at 2080 MHz on average during our test, which is a 4% reduction when compared to the AMD reference model. Then we have the XFX Mercury 319, and this model saw a peak junction temperature of 67°C with a peak hotspot temperature of 77°C, so the same hotspot as the Hellhound. However, unlike the Hellhound, the Merc 319 clocked really well, typically operating at 2270 MHz. That's 9% higher than that of the Hellhound. The fans did run at 1200 RPM, but even so, the card was virtually silent, and a 9% clock discrepancy is much larger than you typically expect. Okay, so that was a lot of data, and I suspect many of you found the numbers disappointing, given that the 7800 XT is basically a 6800 XT in terms of performance. That's hardly exciting stuff after 3 years, and in fact, it's borderline embarrassing for AMD. The only saving grace here is the price, because at $500, the 7800 XT will be the go-to option for many. If we look at our cost per frame graph again, you can see why I suggested a $450 US asking price for the 7800 XT. That would have made it hands down the best buy. But you can also see why AMD didn't push that hard, because at $500 US there's really nothing better in terms of value than the 7800 XT. You're not going to bother with the RX 6800 at $430, and at $530 the 6800 XT is now dead. Prior to the release of the 7800 XT, you could make an argument for the 6800 XT over the RTX 4070, though I think most would have been happy to invest the extra $70 or so in the GeForce GPU for the greatly improved power efficiency, AV1 support, better ray tracing performance, and DLSS 3 frame generation. 13% isn't a huge premium to pay for those features. But when compared to the 7800 XT, the RTX 4070 is 20% more expensive, both support AV1 encoding, the ray tracing gap is reduced, as is power efficiency, leaving DLSS as the only real drawcard for the GeForce GPU. Now, AMD has talked at length about FSR3 and has made some pretty bold claims while doing so, but even now, it's still an upcoming feature, so the RTX 4070 does have the benefit of DLSS and DLSS frame generation. Still, FrameGen is only going to be useful for some of you, so even once AMD gets FSR3 out, a lot of you won't actually care. That being the case for many gamers, the 7800 XT and RTX 4070 are very evenly matched, and with the Radeon GPU $100 US cheaper, it's now the obvious option in my opinion. The bar might have been set low, but even so, that's a solid achievement for AMD. The RTX 4070 is Nvidia's best value offering with more than 8GB of VRAM, and in terms of value, the 7800 XT crushes it, offering more performance and more VRAM at a much lower price. It also makes the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB look foolish, but to be fair, that GPU looked like a clown show at $500 US long before the 7800 XT was even a thing. Overall, this is the first good release from AMD in their RDNA 3 series, so that's a big positive, even if it's coming 9 months after the initial release. And that's really all I can say about the 7800 XT. It's a discounted 6800 XT with a few improvements. Pretty crap really after 3 years, but you know, given how this generation has gone so far, it's good enough. So with no choice really, I guess we'll take it. And that's it for this review of the AMD Radeon RX 7800 XT. Of course, the 7700 XT is also a GPU that's available, I believe now. Maybe this is coming out like a day before the actual launch date, but 7700 XT, we will be reviewing that shortly as well. So stay tuned for that one. Once again, this was a video that was produced by Steve. So this is all his thoughts and analysis and things like that. So fingers crossed Steve can get better soon and be able to present videos again on the channel shortly. But in the meantime, you can give him some best wishes in the comments below, or go down to the description and look for our Patreon and Floatplane links, because if you sign up to those, you'll be supporting the independent testing that goes into reviews such as this, and you get some cool benefits in the meantime, such as we've got our Discord community, monthly live streams, BTS videos, so there's lots of great stuff in there. So thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.